to the latest installment of the Sharp Best Ball Show. I'm your host, Tod Burros, at Best Ball NFL on Twitter, and today we will look for additional edges using offensive line play with our guest, Brandon Thorn of Trench Warfare, and, of course, Establish the Run. Brandon has just dropped his rankings for the new season, and if you're like me, you're going to want to have a membership to Establish the Run. And you can check them out. We will reference them in the podcast, of course, and the stream. And that will help you to maybe find some nice advantages when you are drafting on Underdog Fantasy and trying to take down $3 million. When you do that, you need every edge you can get. And this show is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy and the biggest fantasy football tournament of all time, Best Ball Mania 4, where the first prize is $3 million. Don't know what Best Ball is? It's simple. You just enter Best Ball Manias on its slick mobile app, draft your team, and that's it. Yep, it's set it and forget it, as Underdog optimizes your lineup weekly to create the highest scoring one. It's here, it's Best Ball Mania 4, and it's your shot at a first place prize of $3 million. Get signed up on UnderdogFantasy.com or via the App Store with the promo code SHARPKIT. And they'll not only double your first deposit up to $100, but you'll also receive the Sharp Football Draft Kit for just $1. That kit includes over 40 exclusive fantasy football articles, which will help your chances at winning the $3 million grand prize. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code SHARPKIT. And now let's bring in Brandon. Brandon, how are you today?
Doing good, man. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Big fan of your work. I used it a lot for daily fantasy last year, looking for different edges, and definitely appreciate what you do. Also a member of Trench Warfare. I get the regular email, mostly weekly, sometimes bi-weekly. So literally, Brandon is in the trenches working to help you to understand not just offensive, but defensive line as well. And that reminds me, it's one of those days. There we go. Now you can see me too. That might not be a good thing. So, Brandon, I want to start by getting a little bit on your background and specifically how you look to rate offensive line play.
Yeah, so my background, I got started scouting, football in really like 2014 officially. Before that, I was in the military for 10 years in the Air Force, but I was a huge football fan and all that during that time. But I left the military to pursue scouting. And so 2014 was kind of when I started. It's been 8-9 years now. Man, I've worked for a variety of different media outlets, people, scouted for the Senior Bowl for multiple years, and just a bunch of different places. I guess some of my main kind of breaks, along the way, main mentors as well, were like Dan Hatman with the Scouting Academy. They run an online-based scouting curriculum that is incredible. So I did that in 2014, right away, 2015. So that helped me a lot. And then I got linked up with LaCharles Bentley, who was training offensive linemen in 2016. I played in high school. I always loved offensive line. And then when I joined social media back in like 14, I kind of realized nobody was really talking about the position, and just wanted to figure out a way to combine my love of the position with, kind of that opportunity there, to analyze it. So, LaCharles invited me to his clinic in 2016. Then I met Duke Manyweather, who, is offensive line masterminds. He created that, basically that brand. So started picking his brain. He brought me under his wing. And then I've been working with Duke for 6 years now, doing various scouting work. And then now I've been full-time with it for about 3 years. Bleacher Report, I work a lot with them. They hire me to scout the offensive line class, in the upcoming drafts every year. They've been doing that for 3 years. My Trench Warfare newsletter, Establish the Run. And I do almost all my work is done outside of social media for players and coaches. So I do a lot of scouting videos for NFL players, for college coaches, things like that, advanced scouting, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's all geared around offensive and defensive line play, and I mean, I love what I do, and it's just yeah, it's really a blessing. So yeah, that's what I do, how I got here, kind of a snapshot of it at least, and yeah, established the run. I started with them about 4 years ago now. So, yep,
I'm always up for a good blessing. So,
yeah,
yeah, speaking my language there, LaCharles Bentley, obviously great player, hobbled by a couple major knee injuries,
yep,
or I think he would have been a Hall of Fame player, no doubt. Um,
yeah,
Definitely was sad to see his career cut short by injury. So,
absolutely.
if I understand, I want to take a piece out of something you just said. So because I wasn't aware of that. So you actually work with, when you say advanced scouting for college, do you mean that if, team X is going to play team Y this week, you help them to kind of analyze the play of their opponent?
I've done work like that in the past for players, like for their upcoming specific opponent. That's
Gotcha.
not typically what I do, though. Typically, what I do is I make them videos on techniques that they want to teach their players or to teach how to defeat. So I basically, use my scouting notes, because during the season, I've been watching coaching film, all 22 since about 2014, and I record a lot of videos. So I have a little over like 2 terabytes right now of just film, of teach tape examples from players, categorized by player, by technique, or by team. So I have a huge database going back to that time frame. So if guys want to see, how this guy wins using this rush, I can just type in his name in my library, and I could pull up something, and that's helpful to show for coaches, for instance. That's helpful to show their players, this is how so and so wins using this technique. This is how so and so had success defeating them using that technique. Here's 10 examples, or whatever it is. So that's one way that I can help them. And then for players, like you mentioned, one of them, I've done some advanced scouting work for them where I scout an upcoming opponent and kind of give them a snapshot on how they win, maybe something to keep in mind, one way they could take advantage of them, something like that. And then I also make highlight tapes as well for offensive and defensive linemen. I just made one for Max Crosby, and then mainly offensive line, though. I've done
One
probably
of the
about
most fun guys in the league right now.
Yeah, Crosby's awesome. It was really cool to watch literally every snap of him and just focus on him this past season. And I really gained an appreciation for him against the run as well, which I don't know if a lot of people really give enough credit to. But that's kind of an aside. But yeah, so the highlight tapes is a big thing as well, because offensive linemen don't get highlight tapes, and I'm the one who makes those for them. So I've been fortunate to get to do a lot of those, 40 or 50 over the last few years. So yeah, it's kind of a unique, niche, but yeah, I try to, add value any way I can.
You know what they say, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's amazing. I do have a special request based on that. I always am fascinated by, I'm not what you are, right? But I aspire to continue to add to my knowledge base. I would love for you, for ETR, to kind of go team by team with what the run scheme is and some things about the run scheme, so that you can see if the back, and then maybe does the back, which back on that team fits that run scheme, as a way to kind of find under the radar players. I don't know what your time's like, but if you don't ask, you'll never receive. I think that would be a fascinating addition to what you already do.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds awesome. It would be quite the undertaking for sure, time wise, for me to do that right, because I primarily don't focus on scheme necessarily. I'm more
Gotcha.
focused on
Technique.
players, traits, technique, things like that. But I have a general sense of scheme and things like that. And But yeah, there's probably other guys out there more qualified than me to do that. But I could play a part in a project like that for sure. That would be cool.
Yep, no worries.
Yeah,
It just occurred to me. I thought I would
yeah, it's a good
mention it.
idea.
Yeah, a lot of people who even talk about offensive line play, you don't get much, and when you do, they seem to lump it all line play in together. You take the time each week during the NFL season to go through both run and pass mismatches. Can you explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, so for Establish the Run, I think this is my fourth year, with them now. And so every week, before the season, I'll come out with my top 32 rankings, O and D line, with a focus on pass protection and pass rush. So there may be some of these rankings where the run blocking, may bump or, lessen a team, but I try and focus more on the passing element. So with that being said, during the week, I try to I re-rank basically all 32 pass protection units and pass rushing units based on their upcoming matchup and also based on just how well they're playing at the time. So week 1 is not going to be any different than, my top 32 right now that just came out this morning. Because, for one, they haven't played anybody yet and nothing's really changed. But then week 2, there might be some subtle changes, based on how they played, also considering who they're playing the upcoming week, and then injuries and things like that, of course, make it fluctuate. So I do that week after week throughout the regular season. I also do it in the playoffs. I re-rank all 32 with like an in-depth analysis at the mid-season mark, around week eight or 9. Yeah, and I've had some success with that. I know there was some guy who was tracking how well I did against the spread, and all these cool metrics that he had that were really interesting. Not even my intent, because I'm not trying to necessarily predict game outcomes, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, I'm really just trying to predict, who is going to see the most pressure or the least amount of pressure, and then kind of where it's going to come from, and then let people do with that, what they can, get value out of that however they see fit. But that's kind of what I do. And I base those things, I'd say 95% off of my film study on the players and on the units, both offensive and defensively in the past and that current season, with an emphasis on that current season, of course. But, I'm pretty familiar with these players going years and years back. So I kind of combine all that and try to estimate, pressure or the lack thereof on a weekly basis.
I always work by the theory that when it comes to offensive line play, that the top 5 matter and the bottom 5 matter, but the rest, for the most part, are bunched together, and the juice kind of isn't worth the squeeze. What do you think of that theory, and in general, and that, using that application?
I mean, if you want to keep things like simple and kind of surface level, I think that's, a fair, theory and a fair way to look at it. It'll get you in the ballpark. But, it's kind of hard for me to look at it like that completely because I'm, more in the weeds. So,
Yep.
I would say it changes on a year by year basis, even on a, halfway point of the season basis, depending on the injuries and whatever else happens. But sometimes it's the top 7 that matter more, or the top 8 or the top 4, or, so it kind of varies a little bit. But I'd say generally, it'll get you in the ballpark of kind of, I think, what you're attempting to do there, and just identify
Right.
the real, game changing units. But yeah, so there's, we could go into more specifics if you want, but yeah, I think that's generally an okay way to look at it.
Yeah, and my other question, which I don't know is as relevant, I wasn't aware that you mostly focused on pass protection.
Yeah.
But is there certain lines that people think are a good offensive line, but they're really only good at one half? Individual linemen can be really good at one and be terrible at the other. Units can be, how they play together. Offensive line play is so fascinating overall. But are there any teams that jump out to you as being imbalanced, where people think they're a good offensive line, but really they're only good at one part of it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So yeah, I mean, just initially going off of last year and then with the projections this year as well, I mean, a couple right off the top, I think the Falcons are probably the best example. They're clearly better run blockers than pass protectors. And, another factor into my rankings, of course, is, factoring in what the offensive line is asked to do or what they're not asked to do. And, if you apply that thinking to the Falcons, I think last year they were, top 1 or 2 in rush attempts and play action percentage. So, this is an offensive line that they're tasked with primarily run blocking because that suits their strengths, partly because that suits their strengths. And then when they do pass the ball, they're passing out of heavy formations. So a lot of 12, 21 personnel, things like that, multiple tight ends on the field which obviously kind of helps in pass protection depending on where they're aligned and how they're used. And then when they do pass it, almost the majority of the time, I think more than the majority of the time, it's play action, which means you get to sell the run before you pass, and it makes things a little bit easier. It's much different than a drop back passing scheme.
Or a shotgun, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, even shotgun, you could be a heavy run team like the Eagles. They're a shotgun team, but they run the ball more than they pass. So
right, but what I mean is play action.
Play action. I thought you said shotgun.
Play action.
Yeah.
Obviously, when you're in shotgun, I mean, you see them give that little dippy fake of the handoff,
They
but
run a
it's
lot of RPOs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not nearly as effective as an old fashioned play action.
Yeah, I mean, they're different. RPOs and play action are certainly different, but yeah, I mean, I would say teams that run a high, degree of play action or RPOs, it does alleviate, kind of the burden of offensive linemen and pass protection either way. You could say play action does a little bit more, but yeah, I mean, they both help. So that's something with the Falcons that I always consider. If you put that offensive line in more of a drop back type of scheme, which won't happen, I don't believe, at least not this year, based on who they have on their offensive line, like a guy like Caleb McGarry, I remember studying him coming out of the University of Washington a couple years ago, clearly a better run blocker than pass blocker, really struggled his first couple years in the league. Last year had the best year of his career all of a sudden. Well, Arthur Smith came to the team, installed a completely different scheme. They're running the ball, they're running play action. All of a sudden, Caleb McGarry is an asset. That he didn't really make that much of a jump, necessarily. It was more what he was and wasn't asked to do. So that's one example of a guy on that offensive line that benefits. So that's one team. I think you can mention.
Let me just jump in before you jump out of that team. Jake
Yeah.
Matthews also, I believe, obviously great heritage, family, Hall of Fame, family members. He was a little weak in pass pro coming his first couple years too, if I remember.
Yeah, I mean, Jake Matthews is definitely different than Caleb McGarry. Very different players. Definitely more athletic, better mover, lighter, things like that. Better fit for his, heavy zone type of scheme, but he could do both. Different than McGarry. The thing about Jake Matthews, he also played for, in a Kyle Shanahan scheme, when he was there for that year, and he's been exposed to different things. So we've kind of seen him in a lot of different, schemes. But I mean, I think Jake Matthews is pretty underrated, actually, especially because of offensive line availability is so important. And I mean, if you look at his statistics in terms of games started, I think he's missed one game in 8 or 9 years. I mean, he's like an NFL Iron Man. So yeah, Jake Matthews,
just like either his dad or
like his dad.
Yeah. It was his dad, right? Who was like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very similar in terms of that goes. But yeah, Bruce Matthews, man, just total legend. He was just I was at Offensive Line Masterminds a week ago, and Bruce Matthews was there, so it was really cool. But anyway.
Yeah, and you were going to mention some other teams before I rudely cut you off.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I would. Let me think. Of course, the Ravens, year in, year out, their offensive scheme is very unique. So, their offensive line are obviously run blocking more than pass blocking. Lamar, rights a lot of wrongs when he's playing, in terms of evading pressure, not letting pressure turn into sacks, things like that. That helps. This year is going to be very different, which is going to be interesting. I still think the offensive line is actually, going to be really good this year in that, dramatic change in scheme that they're going through. But that's like a year's past example. I think that's good for sure. Let's see.
Let's go the other way. Let's
Mhm.
go to a team that people think is really terrible, but they're actually not bad in one area.
That people think are terrible. Can you give me maybe a couple that people think are terrible, and I can maybe tell you?
Put up that again, Adam, producer Adam. That's the sharp rankings for this year
Okay.
that we came out with. Probably
Yeah.
not quite as scientific as yours, but
So as far as the bottom 5 here, I would say that I'm definitely higher on the Bucks and the Jaguars. But those, the other 3, I pretty much agree with that. But yeah, the Bucks and the Jaguars, if you want to go into those, let's see.
sure.
So Bucks, for instance, I quite a bit higher on the Bucks, this year. So first of all, I think there is some uncertainty here. This is a transitional phase for the team in many regards. Obviously, with Brady leaving, also with the offensive line, a lot of turnover here. There's going to probably be 4 new starters. Although 2 of them were starters last year, they're just going to be at different positions, and that's Tristan Wirfs and Luke Goedeke. So Tristan Wirfs, probably the second best right tackle in football. He's moving to the left side where he played some in college at Iowa. That's going to be a little bit of uncertainty there. I still think he'll be really good. Luke Godeke's playing right tackle. He played left guard last year. He was really bad. But then the last 2 games of the season, I want to say, he played right tackle, looked much better. I think that's his natural position. That's where he played at Central Michigan. That's where I evaluated him. So I think he'll be better. So you have Wirfs and Goedeke at tackle. I think that'll probably be solid, if not very good. If Wirfs is what he was at right tackle, he's going to be an all-pro. And then inside, I'm pretty bullish on the inside. Ryan Jensen's coming back from a knee injury that kept him out the whole regular season last year. I think he's one of the 3 best centers in football. Matt Filer was signed to play left guard. And then right guard, they drafted Cody Mauch from North Dakota State in the 2nd round, I want to say. So they're very high on him, and he's very much in the mold of guys that they've had success with, small school guys with his playing style. Think Alex Kappa. I think Cody Mauch can have a very similar career arc to him. So, and I think
he's also got that name, like John Madden used to believe a lot in that. Mauch just sounds like a good offensive
Have you seen
lineman.
this guy?
No.
Okay, wait till you. People who listen to this will probably know what he looks like, but he has long red hair and he's missing like 3 front teeth.
Oh, I did see him. Yeah.
Okay,
during the draft, I do that rang a bell.
Yeah. So he's definitely a unique dude in a lot of ways, but he's very athletic. He's nasty. Physical tone setter, good finisher, fits right into with what GM Jason Light likes in Tampa. So I just feel like this offensive line is going to be middle of the pack. They're only spending about like $23.5 million on their offensive line, which ranks 31st in the NFL. So, I can understand how maybe expectations are that this is a total rebuild type of offensive line, but Ryan Jensen's a Pro Bowler. Tristan Wirfs is an All-Pro, even though he's switching positions. I like Mauch, and then Matt Filer I think is pretty solid. I mean, I don't think Baker Mayfield's going to do them any favors. I think he's actually going to make them look worse than they are. And that's another piece.
He never does.
Things. That's another piece of things that I factor into all this is quarterback play as well. So you can't evaluate offensive line without evaluating the quarterback. It doesn't work. So with that said, Baker Mayfield, if you want to factor him into this heavily, he's not going to do them any favors. He's going to invite pressure and he's going to take sacks. So that's going to make them look worse than I think they actually are.
And it could end up leading to Trask playing, right?
Possibly, yeah. I mean,
if they're not going to go anywhere. I mean, Baker Mayfield, you got to give John McVay a tremendous amount of credit for what he got out of Baker Mayfield. but anywhere else he's been, he's just looked miserable. Let's talk a little bit about player movement and free agency. What are some of the moves that caught your attention the most, and situations that have changed that most people might not have accounted for? We put up some of the bigger contracts up here.
Yeah, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is, well, it wasn't free agency, it was a trade. I would mention Shaq Mason, going from Tampa to Houston. I think that was a pretty
That's my
dramatic.
favorite move.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic upgrade for Houston's offensive line, in my opinion. I think Shaq Mason is maybe the most underrated guard in football, year in, year out. People, I think, have this thing in their mind of him when he came out of Georgia Tech in the triple option offense. He's just a pure road grading run blocker, but he's actually a really good pass protector as well. He got really, really good at that under Dante Scarnecchia in New England. Maybe the greatest offensive line coach of all time. But, Mason, I think year in, year out is just a really well-rounded, good player. That's an upgrade for Houston at right guard that I think is going to really matter. So,
and I think it'll really help Dameon Pierce. I think Dameon Pierce is a very talented runner. He was kind of a mini Nick Chubb last year, and that was one of the moves that really I was buying a lot of Dameon Pierce early in best ball.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes some sense. I think with Mason and Kenyon Green at guard, those guys are both excellent pullers. I think we're going to see a lot of gap scheme in Houston, just to accentuate their strengths. I think that's again, kind of a middle of the pack, offensive line, maybe slightly above average. I see them, just all things considered. Last year they had the worst starting center in football, and that made them look really bad. He was really bad. They drafted 2 centers. So I think that'll at least be better than last year, which may or may not be saying much. But, Laramie Tunsil's a top 3 left tackle in football. Titus Howard is, solid. I think that's a pretty good offensive line. So, Shaq Mason would be somebody that I would throw out there for that. I'm just looking at my list here to see somebody else who you didn't have listed, if there is anybody else that comes to mind. Yeah, free agency. I would say there's more like turnover in the draft, that I think is going to be interesting draft pick wise. So,
yeah, we'll get to that in a sec. But first, I do want to mention that Warren Sharp's 2023 preview book is available for download now. It's over 500 pages of the most unique and in-depth analysis to get you ready for the NFL season. In addition to Warren's unparalleled write-ups, the book features fantasy analysis from Rich Rebar, rookie analysis from Ryan McChrystal, and much more, including incredibly detailed breakdowns of all 32 teams' tendencies and a deep dive into this year's schedule. Go to sharpfootballanalysis.com to get your copy. You will not regret it. So, are there any, but I want to spend more time on the draft too, but I don't want to leave free agency without asking, Shaq Mason left from somewhere, right? Like, what are the teams that are going to be worse based on losing players?
Man, that's a good question. I would say the 49ers losing Mike McGlinchey. That's one, because they're replacing him with Cole McKivitz, who, I don't believe has started any games. And if he's going to be the first year starting in his career, so not that I'm a huge
Trent Williams getting up there in age a bit, a little injury prone too, but he's still elite, right?
Yeah, I'm not worried about Trent Williams. Yeah, okay. He's the best tackle in football. But yeah, Mike McGlinchey, leaving. Mike McGlinchey's, not a great player, but he's good. He's certainly above average, I think. He's a good right tackle. Then there could be potentially going from that to below average right tackle. So that's going to be a difference for sure. I will say, however, going back to kind of some of the scheme talk, the 49ers, in my opinion, are probably one of the 2 or 3 most offensive line friendly schemes in football. So, it's probably going to hurt them less than it would, 95% of teams in the league. But still, in high leverage situations, meaning, down, late in games or obvious pass situations where they have to drop back and they can't put all that window dressing in their offense and they can't run play action and all this stuff. In those scenarios, I think it will hurt them a little bit because McGlinchey was more reliable than McKivitz. So, in certain matchups, certain weeks, I would definitely consider that one to be one where an offensive line would be worse.
Let me follow up again because you just said something very interesting that I think deserves being elaborated on. You said that the San Francisco 49ers have one of the most offensive line friendly systems in the league, correct? Could you please explain for us in a little more detail why that is?
Yeah, well, I will say I don't think I'm breaking news here. It's Kyle Shanahan, Mike Shanahan. I mean, this has been true for 25 years. But, it goes back to, a Shanahan offense. First of all, the run game is tied to the pass game brilliantly. So things look the same. Defenses are consistently on their heels and confused when they face Kyle Shanahan offense. They don't know whether it's run or pass because he's a master at making everything look the same. So that's one thing. A ton of motion, a ton of misdirection, a ton of eye candy pre-snap. That also creates additional, manipulation of the defense that creates advantageous timing and angles for the offensive line in the run game in particular. And then when they do pass, it's a lot of play action. It's a lot of, they do run some RPOs. It's just, you're very rarely going to get a true drop back pass in a 49ers offense. You just never really see that. So
if I understand you correctly, what you're saying isn't that it's offensive line friendly in the sense that there's some teaching, but that they do all the things to support the offensive line to put so that there's less pressure on the player. That's what makes it so friendly.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. That is really good information. Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. And now let's look at the counter, because one guy that I've been fading very hard in drafts at ADP is Alexander Mattison. And one of the big reasons that I'm doing so is because the Shanahan system is no longer there. And I think people still have it in their mind that Minnesota is this great place for running backs when it's a different system. Am I correct there? Because I'm making a pretty big bet on fading Mattison. What is the Vikings situation? And any thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think there's still shades of that system there, but it's not as prominent as it has been in the past for sure. Like when Gary Kubiak was there. It's more of a kind of a passing oriented system, especially with Justin Jefferson. I mean, obviously, but Chris Cooper's the offensive line coach. He was an offensive lineman who played for Mike Shanahan in Denver. So he certainly is very familiar with the Shanahan system, and he's, coaching the offensive line every day. So, you consider that. But yeah, I would say their offensive line is a little bit below average, to me. Especially how I rank it, geared towards passing, pass protection. I mean, if you watch the quarterback series on Netflix, I mean, Kirk Cousins is getting murdered back there, and that's, they returned all 5 starters. So it's not like they went out and upgraded anything. I do expect them to be a little bit better than they were last year, just because they have very young guys who are, expectantly going to get a little bit better at least. But I would still have serious reservations about the interior of their offensive line in pass protection. That's kind of my biggest hang up with their offensive line.
Oh, all right. Excellent. And thank you very much. You mentioned that you do think the draft is obviously a big factor. Tell us some of the teams and some of the players that you're really high on and how it might elevate. We put up some of the early picks. Give us some of your thoughts on these guys and any under the radar guys that you think might, because one thing about offensive line is we found you don't have to be drafted early to be good.
Yeah, for sure. Of those guys that you just put up there, I would say the guy that, for fantasy purposes, especially, that I would pay attention to is Darnell Wright, in Chicago. This is another system, that is very heavy run oriented, because they probably can't pass the ball, very well for a multitude of reasons. For one, they're all better run blockers than pass blockers last year, and the same is true this year. So you don't want to pass the ball a lot with that offensive line. And then the quarterback as well is a whole nother thing. But, obviously you probably would want to run the ball more with Justin Fields than pass, at least now, in the short term. So, with that being said, Darnell Wright to me was maybe the best run blocking offensive lineman in the draft. So you're putting him at right tackle. You signed Nate Davis, who I think you just had a graphic up of earlier in free agency. The right side of the offensive line is revamped. And those guys they're making their money for what they could do in the run game. So you're certainly going to run the ball a lot this year again. Darnell Wright's going to make a big difference. Moving Tevin Jenkins to left guard alongside Braxton Jones, and then with Cody Whitehair at center, I think that offensive line is just set up very nicely to be probably a pretty good run blocking offensive line. However, if the Bears get down in a game and they're playing, the game script gets out of hand and they have to, pass the ball too much and, have too much obvious pass situations, I think it could get, kind of ugly depending on who they're playing, especially, in terms of a pass protection perspective. But Darnell Wright is certainly a rookie, I think, who's going to make an impact, primarily in the run game. I would throw out Matthew Bergeron, Syracuse left tackle who's drafted to play left guard in Atlanta. I think Atlanta last year, their primary weakness was left guard. It was Elijah Wilkinson, I want to say, who's primary starter. So by inserting Bergeron, I think that's a major upgrade. I think he's going to be able to make that transition inside pretty seamlessly based on his skill set and his physical traits. I just think, that's why I have them pretty highly rated this year as an offensive line, even if they are a more run heavy offense and, geared towards that. So Bergeron is certainly one. I think we have to mention Tyler Steen. He's going to be starting for the Eagles. Probably the best offensive line in football. He's probably going to start at right guard. Alabama left tackle moving to right guard. I like Steen coming out, as kind of, I think he got drafted third, fourth round. That's kind of where I had him graded. I think, obviously there's no better place to develop as an offensive lineman than Philadelphia Eagles because of Jeff Stoutland, the offensive line coach. So I expect him to be good. I expect them to, still be the best offensive line in the league probably. So that's going to be a very interesting one nonetheless, though, because Steen is going to Philly and he's going to be playing in between two Hall of Famers for Coach Jeff Stoutland. I mean, he went to the dream scenario for an offensive lineman.
The nut outcome.
Yeah,
you liked him as a player as well.
Yeah, I mean, I thought ideally, he would kind of ease into a starting role because obviously when you're projecting college players, you don't know where they're going to go. So you have to kind of project on a general level.
Right.
But if I was scouting for the Eagles, I certainly could have probably graded him higher, because of knowing who my coach is, who he's going to be playing next to, things like that. So the fact that he went to Philly makes me like him even more. So yeah, I do think he could be an immediate starter there. I mentioned the Houston, situation. Juice Scruggs, Penn State center. He's going to be playing. He's going to start most likely at center. I think that's going to make a difference, considering what they had last year. Man, I mean, the Ravens have a chance to have a rookie left guard starter. The Seahawks have potential to have two starting rookies on their offensive line at center.
And they had
right
two
guard.
Last year.
Yep, and they
had two starting rookie tackles last year.
Yeah, they could have two starting rookies this year.
Are they more run or pass oriented? These guys.
I mean, so there's two guys, Olu Atimi, who won the Remington Award last year for the best center in the country. He got drafted in the 5th round. He's competing with a free agent signing named Evan Brown for the center spot. I think he has a better chance of winning it than their 4th round pick, Anthony Bradford from LSU, is competing with Phil Haynes, who's another 4th-round pick that they picked a couple years ago. But Phil Haynes just got re-signed. I think Phil Haynes is going to win that job. But I think Olu Oluwatimi could, be a starting center, for that team in week 1 as a rookie. So that's another one. I'm not super high on him.
Let
But
me follow up with one more on the Seahawks, because
yeah,
that's a team very interesting, because they added high value rookies in both the pass and the run game. I'm not up on it enough. That I know they were pretty happy with the 2 rookies they played last year.
yeah.
But do you see that as more of a run line, pass line, both?
I see that as kind of a well-rounded one. I'm pretty high on the Seahawks offensive line this year. Considering that they're spending the least amount of money in the entire NFL at the position, I expect their production to way exceed that. So, they're spending like $22.5 million on their offensive line, which is insane. But the reason they're able to do this is because of what you alluded to last year, drafting 2 rookie tackles who both look like long-term starters in Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas. So that's where it starts. They're pillars of the offensive line, and they're both well-rounded. And then inside, you got Damian Lewis at left guard, who I think is an underrated guy. He's good. He's probably not a Pro Bowler, but he's good. And then this center right guard situation, it's a 4-man race. I think regardless of how it plays out, neither of these, options are probably going to be liabilities. I think they might be below average or whatever, but I think you could certainly win with those guys. And if one of those guys plays out and one of those guys is just, middling okay, I think this offensive line could be really good. So, they're very young, very cheap, and I think they're actually going to be pretty good. So from a team building perspective, like they're in an incredible spot right now. It's pretty cool.
I love that. I mean, I could sit here and pick your brain on this probably for 2 hours. We don't have 2 hours. I want to get to a couple other teams that I have questions on. The Bengals had a really bad line 2 years ago and took steps in each of the last 2 years. We've got this situation with Joe Mixon. To me in the playoffs, that for the first time you really saw them say, hey, let us drop back and throw the ball. Tell us about their offensive line, the tendencies there, and how you think it might affect the outlook for that team.
Yeah, so the fact that they went out and signed Orlando Brown, was a huge splash, big surprise. But I definitely understood it, and actually did a film room with Orlando Brown for my Substack, which was really, I think, informative for this discussion as well. But just talking to him about it and whatnot, and kind of looking at his strengths, I think they really wanted to improve, the depth of the pocket, particularly from the tackle spot. And Orlando Brown, I mean, he's 6'8", 360 pounds. You're not really going to go through him. You have to go around him, and that's difficult, just because of the sheer girth and length that he has. And he's a pretty good technician as well, even though he's not a good athlete. So with that being said, he's going to be a guy who's going to do really well against power rushers, kind of keeping the depth of the pocket intact, giving Burrow a little bit more room to operate. So I think, getting Orlando Brown as an upgrade, I think he's a good starter, and he's certainly reliable as well, which is a huge feather in his cap, especially at his size. And then inside of him, you have one of the biggest left guards in football in Cordell Volson, who, was a rookie last year, 5th-round pick, starter, 4th or 5th round. He's like 6'7", like 320. So this left side is enormous now. And, that'll help in some ways. It could be exploited as well, depending on the matchup. And then, Alex Kappa, rock solid. And then at right tackle, Jonah Williams is going to compete with La'el Collins, who is going to come back at some point in training camp. I think that is probably going to be a solid situation at right tackle, regardless of who plays there. I think Jonah's probably going to have that spot, though. He's healthier. Even though he's coming back from a knee injury as well. La'el Collins has more wear and tear on his body. I don't see him ever reclaiming what he was, unfortunately. But Jonah, I think, will be, fine there. I have this offensive line ranked slightly above average. So I see them being kind of similar to last year, a little bit better than last year, is kind of what I see.
But a
So
little bit better pass protecting,
I think so.
a little bit about the same with running.
Yeah, I would probably say a little bit, better in both.
Good.
But
And
yeah,
that's all you need when you've got someone as good as Joe Burrow and the weapons
right.
they have,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Fractions of seconds can be
yep.
like minutes when you're trying to defend against this team.
Yeah, exactly. You just needed to get a little bit better, and the way Jonah Williams played at left tackle last year was not good. He took a major drop off because in 2021 he was really good, but then last year he just took a step back. And their timeline is right now. They couldn't afford to mess around with the tackle position, so they went out and signed Orlando Brown. Totally get it. So yeah, I think they did the right thing, and they'll be a little bit better.
Awesome. Aaron Rodgers goes to the Jets. The Jets are another team
Yeah.
that have invested a lot on the offensive line, and they've got one of the sneakiest under the radar opportunities if Mekhi Becton can ever get healthy. Tell us about the offensive line of the Jets, how you think it will enhance or not enhance the weapons there.
Yeah, so the Jets I have like really is like a middle of the pack offensive line projector right now, somewhere between 15 and 18. They're spending the 15th most in the NFL. Kind of, I think you're kind of gonna get what you pay for, in a sense. I think their production is kind of gonna match what they're spending at the position, which is fine. If they're the 15th best offensive line in the league, that's plenty good. But there are some serious question marks as well.
Quick interjection.
Yeah.
What were because to compare apples and apples, what was the offensive line rated for the Packers that Rodgers played for last year?
In my last year's rankings?
Yeah. In other words, were they also right in the middle of the pack? Is Rodgers getting an upgrade or is he getting a downgrade or about the same?
Um, I would need to go back and look because I think it varied quite a bit. Early in the year, they were lower. Later in the year, they were higher because David Bakhtiari came back.
He came back, yeah.
Right. So with Bakhtiari in there and when they're fully healthy, I think it's a downgrade. But, I'd say overall last year, it's probably somewhere closer to the middle if you factor in how they were, beginning and end. But Rodgers is used to playing behind great offensive lines. That's just, he's played behind great offensive lines his whole career. So this is a downgrade, I think, here in New York. But I don't know if it's, detrimental, because I still do think this is a middle of the pack offensive line. But, my questions are primarily at tackle. You mentioned Mekhi Becton. He's played, one game in 2 years. So, that's a huge question mark. If he doesn't play, you'll still probably be okay, because they have Max Mitchell there, who's, I think a fine player, rookie last year out of Louisiana Lafayette. He played admirably when he played last year. So he'll be okay. But you ideally want Mekhi Becton. If he is healthy and playing, then I think that this offensive line could be better. But I'm going into the season skeptical because we just haven't seen it. And then also their left tackle, Dwayne Brown, is 38 years old, coming off of shoulder surgery as well. They kept him out of 4 games last year. So at tackle, it could fall apart real quick. And this thing could be, it could get ugly quickly, because they don't really have great depth, behind both tackle spots. No team in the NFL does. So I like the interior. And I think if the tackles can stay healthy, this could be a really good offensive line.
Could Vela Tucker be one of the best in the game?
I think he's the best offensive lineman on the team, hands down. He's, to me, already, probably one of the 6 to 8 best right guards in football. So yeah, I'm very high on him. I think he's really good.
Traded up a
He's their
lot
best
to
player.
get him.
Yeah.
All right. The Bills line isn't great, but is it as bad? I think people really think it's a bad offensive line and that it'll hold Josh Allen back from a pass protection standpoint. What are your thoughts on the Bills?
Yeah, I could kind of go either way here. I have them, just outside my top 20. in offensive line rankings. So, in the same tier as the Jets, although the Jets are at the very top of that tier. So they're closer to the next one than the Bills for sure. The Bills are kind of closer to the one, after them. They went out this offseason and they certainly attempted to get better. They've attempted to improve their offensive line every year. They've done a great job, I think, kind of building the offensive line. They just had some unfortunate injuries that has derailed, their process. I think the key for the Bills offensive line this year is right tackle Spencer Brown. I think this is third year now, coming out of Northern Iowa, small school, came out very raw. He's an athletic, phenom, I think is probably fair to say, just a complete athletic freak. But he's very raw, and he missed last offseason due to injury. He missed training camp, and that was vital. He went into the year, just kind of behind, and he never really could quite get there. So now he's healthy, full off season. We're going to see now, like, if Spencer Brown is going to be good, I think. And if he is actually functional and maybe average, I think this offensive line is going to be pretty good. Now, if he plays how he did last year and the year before, it could be more of the same, with the offensive line kind of being a hindrance to the offensive the offense as a whole. So I think they got a little bit better at left guard with Connor McGovern, replacing Rodgers Saffold. And then they drafted Osiris Torrance in the second round from Florida, who's definitely a better run blocker than pass blocker. But I think he'll be a slight upgrade. So 2 slight upgrades at guard. They have a really good center already. They have a good left tackle. But to me, it all boils down to Spencer Brown. I mean, if he is a little bit more reliable in pass protection, this thing could, be firing on all cylinders. But he could also derail it pretty quickly as well.
Well, that's interesting because it could have been the answer to my next and last question. And I want to thank you very much for coming on. Just fabulous information. We're definitely going to get you guys over to see what, Brandon's rankings have just dropped. I'm going to be going there myself and reading every single word that Brandon has written over the last few days on offensive line. And my last question for you, Brandon, is give me a surprise team, that surprised you when you did your research, where you thought they would be lower and you ended up putting them higher.
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of touched on, I think Seattle surprised me a little bit. I think they were a little bit higher than I thought going in.
You could give me surprise worse too.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you another kind of, and I mentioned them as well. I think the Texans also surprised me. I think their offensive line is going to be, pretty good. I said it in my article. I kind of think that the rise of the offensive line in Houston kind of matches the positive vibes that are, reverberating across the franchise right now with what they did in the draft and, hiring DeMeco Ryans.
They brought in.
Yeah, like I think the
offensive major upgrade at head coach.
Yeah, I mean, Shaq Mason, and then they're not going to have the worst center in the league, I don't think. So that's in of itself just going to make things a little bit better. And maybe a lot better. I think that's in the cards as well. So I think they're a little bit of an above average offensive line, and that surprised me a little bit. And then the Bucs as well, we talked about, I think they surprised me a little bit as well, considering they're not spending much money. But I will kind of, undergird that opinion with the fact that Baker Mayfield's there, and that's not going to help anything. So anyway,
I lied. I forgot. I'm a Giant fan. Okay. They finally put some assets there. Obviously, the left tackle is a player. The right tackle, to me, I didn't love the pick last year as a fan. I thought that he got beat too easily, in pass pro. Tell the Giants offensive line, please.
Yeah, so I have them ranked, outside the top 20 as well. But that's another team, I think, where you really have to look at kind of the infrastructure, the environment that they're operating in Brian Daboll's scheme, which I think is a really good scheme, and it really accentuates the strengths of the offensive line. They ran the second highest percentage of play action in the NFL last year, a balanced run pass split. So they're balanced, heavy play action, a very conducive environment for development for offensive line. So not asked to do, the hardest things in the world, compared to maybe some other offensive lines. So with that said, you mentioned Andrew Thomas, certainly a top 5 left tackle in the game, in my opinion now. So he's your building block. And then after that, I think it's either John Michael Schmitz or Evan Neal are probably going to be your second best player on the offensive line. Now, that could go one of two ways. I mean, Evan Neal, you mentioned he struggled last year, especially against speed. Hassan Reddick, really jumps out to me. But, he's 6'7", 360. He's going to have to learn to kind of grow into his body a little bit. He was 21 years old last year. I could see, I'm not going to say he's going to have the same trajectory as Andrew Thomas, but Andrew Thomas, as
Thomas started slow.
He was very bad.
He was very bad as a rookie. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, got a little bit better second year. And then, just extra, just extremely, had an extremely big jump, the following year. I don't know if Evan Neal is going to necessarily get there, but I do think he has a good chance of being better than he was last year. And, considering he's 22 years old now, I think that just be patient with him, for another year or so. John Michael Schmitz was my top center in the draft. I don't see an all-pro, but I definitely see like a Ben Jones, who was the Titans starting center for a decade. That's the kind of player I see.
And the Giants center has been terrible for,
I know,
just
since
terrible
for Richburg.
Yeah. Well, even Richburg wasn't like Richburg when he first came out was okay, but he got the injuries and,
Yeah, I think he was more than okay, but yeah, the injuries did really.
I trust you more than me.
Yeah, he was really good there, man, for a couple of years. But yeah, the injuries really killed him. But anyway, yeah, I think John Michael Schmitz could really be a solidifying presence for the interior of the offensive line. And left guard's a big question mark. I don't really see that position being, very good. Hopefully it's not bad. I like Joshua Azudu. Hopefully he can win that job. But Mark Lewinsky's okay. I think the guards are going to be okay. The center could be solid. Again, similar to the Bills, where their right tackle is going to kind of make or break, where the offensive line can go. I think the same could be said with the Giants and Evan Neal. So, right now I'm going in outside the top 20 on their offensive line, but I could see a path where they can get a little bit better than that. But they're not going to be
and smart enough to scheme to their strengths.
I
know they brought over the guy from Philadelphia, the assistant general manager, who had a reputation at being able to uncover some of these late offensive line guys. So I'm hoping that we start, as these drafts start adding up, we start seeing, the fruit of that, and they actually got the right guy out of the team.
Yeah. Hopefully that happens. They drafted one offensive lineman this year, so he's going to start at center. We'll see in future years, though. That'll be interesting to see kind of who they acquire or whatnot.
Awesome. Tell everyone where they can find you, Brandon. And again, thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed this very, very much.
Yeah, likewise, man. I appreciate you having me. So trenchwarfare.substack.com. People can go to that link and sign up for my newsletter. I have a lot of stuff coming out before the season, but in season is really when I dial it up, another level, and then establish the run, of course, and then Bleacher Report. We'll see if they're going to do it another year, but as of right now, it looks like I'll probably be back for a fourth year scouting college offensive lineman for them. And my Twitter, which I think you have right there, Brandon Thorn NFL. Find a lot of my information there as well.
Awesome. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks to Brandon. Next week, we have Matthew Harmon. We're going to be hitting the wide receiver position. I'm a big fan of his reception perception, and we're going to look for some sleepers at the wide receiver position for Best Ball. I'm Todd from PA, or at Best Ball NFL. We will see you next week.